friends, and welcome once again to my home in northeast Edmonton in Alberta, Canada. And this is Recital 5 of our Isolation Week organ recitals. At the beginning of this series, I expressed the enormous frustration that I, as a church musician, could not reach the people that I serve in my congregation because they could no longer come in the doors of the church. And it has been my hope that this recital series has managed to overcome that deficiency to whatever small extent it may have. In Canada at this time right now, we have just experienced a terrible tragedy a week ago in Nova Scotia with an inconceivable killing spree. So at this time, we need to find a way to express our shock, our grief, and our confusion. Perhaps this little bit of music by Edward Elgar, Nimrod from the Enigma Variations, can do for you what music does best, to wordlessly and safely and ritually allow you to let out some of those feelings. So as a tribute to the fallen in Nova Scotia, allow me to play for you Nimrod from the Enigma Variations. first conceived of this recital, of course, that tragedy had not happened, but another tragedy a year ago had happened. We were all shocked, the whole world was shocked, to see Notre Dame in Paris going up in flames. And I expressed my grief over that to a number of, well, not exactly religious friends of mine who didn't understand the importance of Notre Dame. So I would like to dedicate the rest of this recital to be a celebration of Notre Dame de Paris, and in hopes that the renovation of it will proceed after everybody's out of isolation, because it's on a halt right now, will proceed very well, and that they will be able to restore the cathedral to its full glory. Why? Because Notre Dame is incredibly important in the history of civilization. The whole movement for Gothic architecture was started by Abbot Suger in the apse end of the Church of Saint-Denis in Paris, but he didn't need to explore all of the inventions which needed to come about to make full high Gothic flower. And the first time that really happened was at Notre Dame in Paris. So if I can show you on my model here, which I got, which I made from paper, which was available from a wonderful store that we had in Edmonton, not store, but museum, the Strathcona Toy Model and Toy Museum, which no longer exists, unfortunately, but where you could get these amazing paper models. Anyway, this is a very tiny representation of Notre Dame de Paris, and I can tell you at least a couple of the amazing innovations that they integrated into its construction. So this is reason number one why Notre Dame is important. First, the architecture. Let's first off, you can see better than any plan, the cruciform plan of the church, so that the cross of Christianity is right there in the architecture of the building. Secondly, they were able to support the heavy stone vaulting rather than using heavy masonry walls which had tiny windows in order to support the lead roofing and the heavy stone vaulting. They invented a new device. They transferred all of that outward thrust from that through these things right here called flyers to buttresses on the far side of the building. So by putting the skeleton of the building in stone on the outside of the building, they were able to open up the walls for huge windows of stained glass. And I can show you the difference between this high Gothic architecture and what's called Romanesque in Europe and Norman in England, with a different cathedral. This is Southwell Minster in England, and it is Romanesque or Norman, as they call it in England. And you can see that it uses rounded arches, not the pointed arches of Gothic, and that it doesn't have buttresses. It uses the side aisle as its means of support, and that you have only little tiny holes for windows there. So a very dark place indeed. And well, we needed to explore the extreme limitations of the building material, which makes Notre Dame one of the first modern buildings, I think, in that modern architecture is always exploring the far limits of materials, and Notre Dame was doing that exactly then as well. Second reason why Notre Dame is important is musically. Paris at the time, of course, was becoming a major university city, and when there's a major university in a city, there are major thinkers and radical thinkers, and so it was starting to explore differences in thought, and in this case, differences in music. So up till now, the music in churches had been monodic, one line of music, Gregorian chant, and then it had developed a little bit into what we call organum, not organum, don't say it that way, it's organum, where they would do it in parallel fifths or fourths. But this was not quite enough for the brave intellectuals that were now working at Notre Dame, specifically a character named Leoninus, who was born in roughly 1160. He decided that those two parts could be a little bit more independent rather than being slavishly parallel like that. He took one of the lines and made it a long held line, held 10, like tenaciously held, in the tenor. That's where that term comes from, and then allowed the other line to explore all sorts of freedom in harmony and in rhythm, and therefore was starting to invent, without knowing it, the seeds of modern music. Even though this piece that I'm about to play for you may sound pretty darn distant, these are the origins of modern tonality. So this is Hec Dies by Leoninus. Hec Dies means this is the day. It's an antiphon for Easter Sunday. And it would have been composed probably about the year 1200, when Notre Dame might have been built about that far. So they always build the choir end or the altar end first, and they proceed through to this end. So at that point, it might have been built about that far, all of that, but it may have been built all the way to the towers, but not the towers yet. But it was not a completed cathedral. So this music evolved with the cathedral. That's why Notre Dame is important. It's important to remember that that music would actually have been sung rather than played on an organ. At that time, Notre Dame did not have its famous organ now. It may have had a small one somewhere near the choir area, but the first organ was built in Notre Dame in 1403 by Friedrich Chambans, according to Wikipedia. And this music was sung, and it's difficult music, so it required singers from the university to deal with its complexities. Now, Periton had a younger apprentice, or someone who succeeded him. I said Leoninus, didn't I? Said Periton. It was Leoninus. Now, his young apprentice was Peritinus, or Peritin. He worked maybe 30 years after Leoninus, so he would have worked in probably the completed cathedral, and he decided to expand on this exploration of what was going on in music at the time. So it wasn't only two parts that he was composing with. He would do 3 and 4 parts in what were called triplum and quadruplum organum. So I'm going to play for you a piece, again, which would have been sung by the highly skilled university-educated singers in Paris. in Notre Dame called Organum Triplum by Perotinus or Perotin, and his dates are 1180 to 1236. Now, it still sounds a little bit foreign, but this music already has hints of modernity in it. Given that it's exploring three voices, it has happened in the course of this short piece to have stumbled on about three major chords, which, oddly, when I was studying music history in university, they told us that those were forbidden, that the third in music was La Diabolus in Musica, and forbidden because it was far too pleasurable, sensual, and therefore had to be the work of the devil. So obviously these people weren't too terribly concerned about that, and Perotin explored that, and mostly by accident managed to happen on some of those thirds. But they became, as people said, oh, I like that, as was going on in music, much more part of the harmonic repertoire, and also the way of writing down notation, and particularly rhythmic notation, was starting to develop as well. A fellow named Guillaume de Machaut wrote what is called the Messe de Notre Dame, which actually was not for Notre Dame Cathedral, it was for Reims Cathedral, but he was about, again, 50 years later, his dates are 1300 to 1377, so he's working in what is a completely new, the developed style that started with Leoninus. I'm going to play for you a not church piece right now on not organ sounds. This is called Chanson Baladée, and you can see how far music has developed. It's very recognizably modern. It's a real toe tapper. You could absolutely dance to this piece, especially with the curious stop step that happens in the middle of it twice. And there's relative minor and relative major all the way through in this little piece. So, Chanson Baladée by Guillaume de Machaut. modern music in that. Now I'm going to skip over, well, 500 years of music history, so lest this talk deteriorate into a lecture on music history, which is not what I want. I want it to be a tribute to Notre Dame. So we are going to go to one of the masters of music in Notre Dame and at the court of Louis XV. I think in one recital I said 14th. He played for Louis XIV, but he worked in the court of Louis XV, the second longest reigning monarch in French history. Louis-Claude Daquin, and from his series of 12 Noëls, this is going to be Noël number 3, and this is one of the pieces which would have been played on the organ that had just been built in Notre Dame by François Thierry in 1730, and a very Baroque organ, a very charming Noël over a pedal point, indicating that pastoral nature of Christmas music. I hope you will enjoy this charming little piece. of course, at this time, French history was very, very much happening. So, between, after King Louis the 15th came Louis the 16th, who you will remember is, of course, the king during the French Revolution. And a fellow named Claude Balbastre, who was so famous for his Christmas Eve services that a bishop actually forbade him to play the Christmas Eve services because the church was becoming way too packed to even hold Mass. What a problem to have. I wish we had it these days. Anyway, Claude Balbastre wrote this charming piece called Cannonade, and it's very likely that it would have been first performed at the court of Versailles, where he was also working for Louis XVI, and demonstrating to the powdered, periwigged noble people that all lived at Versailles, because Louis XIV way back had gathered them all together there, so he kept them under his thumb. Anyway, he was playing for these people his imitation of what a barrage of cannons sounded like. And it made this incredibly charming piece, which works so well on organ. He uses all the pedals. You stomp them all down, as many of them as you can, to indicate the sound of the cannons. But I'd like to say this, that at this turbulent time in history, if this is what those very much removed noble people at Versailles thought that a war was like, no wonder the French Revolution happened. at this time suffered in the full fury of the French Revolution. Like all revolutions, the first thing they decide to get rid of is religion because it has such a strong influence on people. So, our beloved Notre Dame was rechristened as a temple of reason, and all the statues of the Virgin Mary in Notre Dame were rechristened as the goddess of reason. But that only lasted for about 10 years, but it got so bad that they were stabling horses and just using the building as a storage shed, and it deteriorated drastically during that time. But along came Napoleon, and Napoleon, in trying to govern the French people, realized that it was easier to govern them if he gave them back the Catholic faith. A very sound decision that he made. Plus, he also wanted to have his coronation held at a cathedral of Notre Dame, and it had to be a cathedral in order to do that. So all was reinstated, and that's the reason why France officially is a Catholic country to this day. But the cathedral itself had suffered a great deal and was in really rough shape. And along came an architect named Viollet-le-Duc, who realized that the structure of the cathedral needed massive repairs at that point. The old medieval spire had long since been removed because it was far too dangerous, and he wanted funds to rebuild the structure of the building and to build the spire, which dates from his time, which alas, just a year and a week ago, was in the terrible fire, collapsed that way through the vaulting, through the roof and through the vaulting, and did so much damage inside. But anyway, he thought, very cleverly, he thought, well, he needed to raise public awareness of the cathedral. So he went to his friend Victor Hugo and said, is there something that you can write that will fire the public imagination? And so Victor Hugo wrote what we call the Hunchback of Notre Dame, in French, Notre Dame de Paris. And it had an enormous impact on reinvigorating the public's appetite for Notre Dame and enthusiasm for it. In chapter 12, there's a long description of the cathedral, which probably went more than anything a long way towards getting the cathedral rebuilt and renovated. Perhaps we should try that trick right now. And the Hunchback of Notre Dame is still in public imagination to this very day. So Notre Dame got, the organ was also in terrible shape, and so along came Cavaillé-Coll, Aristide Cavaillé-Coll, who was pioneering so many things in organ building, having a really wonderful influence at the time, much better than the influence of Robert Hope Jones in England, say. His organs were incredibly musical, Cavaillé-Coll's that is, and had some striking new voices, particularly the oboe that he used, and the flute harmonique and the montreuse, which gives such a smooth tone quality. So these were all to be exploited by anybody who had the brilliance to do so. So along came Louis Vierne, another, dare I say it, blind organist, almost blind. He could see a tiny little bit, but he was, for all intents and purposes, legally blind, who wrote so much wonderful music, is one of my favorite composers, and wrote this series of 24 pièces en style libre, 24 pieces in free style. And this is the Lied, or that's German for song, from that collection. Viern's fame was such that he was in constant demand as a traveling recitalist. And in somewhere in the 1920s, he went to England for the dedication of the new Catholic Cathedral of Westminster, in Westminster, in London. And Viern's friend, Henry Willis the third or fourth, I'm not sure which, was the one who built the organ for that cathedral. It's a magnificent organ. And Viern wanted to do something very English for the recital that he was going to give on this newly built organ by Henry Willis. And Willis whistled for him the chimes of Westminster. And Viern then proceeded in the course of the recital to improvise a piece on the Westminster chimes. Now, we're not quite certain whether Willis got it wrong, because the way most people think the chimes go is not the way that the actual chimes go if you listen to them on YouTube or in person. I was surprised to find out that I thought that they were a little different than they are. But it really doesn't matter. What matters is that the brilliant Viern improvised this amazing piece that you're about to hear, and then revised it, and it became one of the triumphant pieces that he would play at Notre in Paris, the first performance being in November of 1929. So here is the Carillon de Westminster, and I'm going to change the camera angle for you so that you see less of my head and more of my feet, because the feet are in fact very busy in the course of this piece. you goodbye till the next rehearsal. I will wish you good health. I urge you to keep practicing your social distancing and your isolation because we are winning the battle. Stick with it, friends.